That morning, Savannah was dressed in a cool gray. A light drizzle fell, coating the weeping oaks and ancient cobblestone streets in a fine mist. Emily Turner stood silently in the small cemetery south of town, among the narrow rows of pews, listening to the eulogy that echoed as if from another world. Beside her, Robert Turner, Emily's father, wore a dark suit, his hands clasping the brim of his hat. His face showed little emotion, but his dark eyes said it all. No tears, no lamentations. It was the silence that made Emily's heart clench. As the dark wooden coffin was slowly lowered into the ground, Emily clutched her mother's old shawl, Margaret Turner's, an item that still had a familiar scent. Every thread of the fabric seemed to hold the tenderness and warmth that Margaret had brought to their family. Margaret was not only Emily's mother, but also the gentle, enduring center of their lives. Her absence, therefore, left more than a void. It threw their world off course, never to be restored. After the funeral, the relatives quietly left, leaving father and daughter standing alone beside the new grave. There were no more condolences, no more brief hugs, only an emptiness that seeped into their flesh. On the way back, through the rain-stained window, Emily saw the old house looming, its faded tiled roof, its wide porch strewn with fallen leaves. A sense of emptiness welled up inside her. What had once been a safe place was now a shell of lost memories. As the heavy wooden door slammed shut behind them, the house swallowed them up in a thick silence. And in that moment, Emily realized, the real pain wasn't in the final farewell. It was in the endless days ahead, when every breath, every step, she had to learn to survive in a world without her mother. The first night after the funeral passed slowly, and a thick silence filled the house. Emily sat curled up on the old sofa, her eyes absently watching the fire die down in the fireplace. Across the room, Robert Turner sat motionless in his favorite armchair. The black suit he had worn since that morning had not been changed, as if changing into another outfit would force him to admit the loss had occurred. Emily rose quietly and walked into the kitchen. She made 2 cups of Earl Grey tea, her mother's favorite, out of a habit rooted in her subconscious. She placed 1 cup in front of her father. Robert glanced at the tea, then turned away, his eyes blank. Emily did not blame him. She understood that, at this moment, mere existence was a great effort for him. The house that had once been filled with laughter and conversation had become unfamiliar. Only the slow ticking of the pendulum clock remained, ringing out like a painful reminder of time, the only thing that kept moving forward. Regardless of the human heart still stuck somewhere in the past, Emily wandered around the house, gently caressing familiar objects. The coat her mother had left on the shelf, the unfinished book on the table by the window. Each small object seemed to be soaked in memories, making her steps slow. When night fell completely, Emily went upstairs. The childhood room was still intact, the old paintings her mother had hung in the past. The small wooden bed that had suddenly become so large and lonely. She lay quietly, listening to the wind blowing through the window and her father's slow footsteps downstairs. Sometimes, she heard the porch door open slightly, then the wind and cold air coming in. Emily pictured her father sitting silently on the porch, his eyes scanning the dark sky, where he hoped to find some remnant of Margaret. The next morning, Emily woke up with a heavy feeling clinging to every muscle. She went down to the kitchen, made coffee, her mother's morning routine, knowing that today, like the days to come, no one would remind her to add a drop of vanilla, or giggle because the coffee was too strong. The house was still quiet, but this time, Emily felt it clearly. It was not just the absence of people. It was the silence of 2 souls lost, unable to find a way to reach each other in the vast sea of pain. The days after the funeral passed slowly and darkly. Emily and Robert Turner lived under the same roof, but an invisible distance between them grew wider and wider. In the morning, Emily prepared a simple meal, a few slices of toast, a pot of hastily brewed coffee. She always placed a portion in front of her father, but most of the time, Robert just sat there staring at the steaming cup, not touching it. Emily's questions and gentle invitations were often met with curt nods or gentle shakes of the head. It seemed that there was no longer a common language between them, only the scattered echoes of an unnamed sadness. Emily tried to keep busy, cleaning the living room, dusting the dusty picture frames, tending to the potted plants her mother had loved. But the more she tried, the more clearly she felt the loneliness like a growing shadow around her. There were times when she caught her father's eyes glancing over the old wedding photo of him and his mother. His cloudy eyes filled with a bottomless sadness. But in a flash, Robert would turn away, burying himself in old newspapers or sitting for hours in front of the TV without really watching. One afternoon, when Emily was collecting old clothes her mother had left in the room to wash, she happened to find a dark blue wool scarf, still smelling of the familiar perfume. As she held the scarf in her arms, her father suddenly appeared in the doorway. His eyes darkened. Without a word, Robert stepped forward, took the scarf from her, and held it to his chest as if it were the only thing left of a loved one. Emily stood still, a feeling of helplessness curling her heart. She understood that in that moment, every object, every piece of memory had become so sacred that no one else was allowed to touch it. On long nights, Emily would hear her father's footsteps in the hallway, the hinges of the porch door opening, then silence. Robert would sit on the porch where he and Margaret used to sit and talk late into the night, his eyes searching the vast sky, searching for something he knew would never return. Emily lay in the dark, feeling the loneliness in every breath, in every faint sound left in the vast house. Although living under the same roof, Emily and Robert were like two isolated planets, orbiting in their own orbits, separated by light years of memories and unnamed pain. She had thought that pain would bring them closer together. But now, Emily understood that loss could also create invisible walls, walls built not of bricks and stones, but of fear and unshared sorrow. And deep down, Emily knew, if she wanted to find her father, she would have to learn to patiently step over each of those cold bricks. One small step each day. One evening, when the light from the fireplace was only a faint orange glow on the wall, Robert Turner spoke suddenly. Emily was sitting at the dining table, quietly turning the pages of her mother's old notebook, searching for a little piece in the fragments of her notes. Her father's soft voice startled her. "Emily," Robert said, his voice hoarse as if it had been a long time since he had spoken. She looked up at him. Her father was standing near the living room door, holding a small, old wooden box, something Emily had never seen before. Robert walked slowly closer, placing the box on the table between them. For a moment, the heavy silence seemed to freeze the room. "These are the things your mother treasured most," he said, his eyes never leaving the box. "I think it's time for you to keep them." Emily carefully opened the lid. Inside, small mementos emerged. A handkerchief embroidered with Margaret's name, a photo of the three of them at Tybee Beach, a few faded letters, and a silver bracelet worn over the years. She reached out to touch the bracelet, feeling the smoothness of the metal, as if the flesh in her palm was trying to connect with a distant memory. Robert followed her movements, his eyes shining with a gentle sadness. "Your mother," he hesitated, his voice catching in his throat. "She had a habit of touching this bracelet every night, as a reminder that there were still precious things to be kept." He sat down across from Emily, their bony hands clasped together. "I don't want you to replace her," Robert continued, his voice low and quiet as a whisper. "Just, if you can, help me keep what she kept." Emily looked deep into her father's eyes, sensing the vulnerability beneath the tough exterior. She nodded slowly, not asking any more questions. In that moment, between father and daughter, something changed, as light as the first wind of the season. But enough to shake long-closed doors. They didn't need to say much. Just a silent agreement, and the belief that no matter how much loss, love could still be reconnected, through the smallest of actions. Robert Turner sat in silence for a long moment after handing the box to Emily. The flickering firelight reflected off his face, highlighting the lines that had been stained by time and the lingering sadness. Emily sat opposite, her hands gently stroking the old silver bracelet, feeling the weight of the memories it carried. Finally, her father spoke again, his voice deeper and more hesitant than before. "Emily," he began, his eyes looking down at the table as if searching for courage. "There's something I want to ask you." She looked up, waiting. Robert clasped his hands together, as if gathering the strength to say what he had been holding on to. Every night before, your mother would do something small for me. A cup of tea, a note, or just a touch on the hand. He paused, trying to contain his emotions. She always reminded me that no matter how much life threw me, there was someone there. Emily listened, her heart sinking at the simplicity and loneliness that permeated her father's every word. Robert looked up at her, his eyes shining with a vulnerability he had always tried to hide. "I don't have anyone to remind me like that anymore," he said softly, "but if you could remind me that I'm not alone, it might make things a little easier." Emily nodded, feeling her throat tighten. She didn't need to think. She didn't need to make flowery promises. Because she understood. Her father wasn't looking for pity. Nor was he asking for a replacement. He was just holding on to a fragile thread. Holding on to what little warmth remained in a world that had become too empty. And Emily knew, from this moment on, she was willing to be there, not to fill the void, but to walk through it with her father, bit by bit. The next morning, the small kitchen in the old house in Savannah was filled with soft yellow sunlight. Emily Turner stood alone at the counter, carefully spooning coffee into the coffee maker. She remembered the mornings when her mother, Margaret, would always be the first to rise, letting the fragrant aroma of coffee waft through the house. Today, Emily tried to recreate that ritual, not just for herself, but for her father. When the cup of coffee was placed on the table, Robert Turner was already there. He looked at the steaming cup in front of him, a momentary hesitation on his face. Finally, he picked it up, brought it to his lips and took a small sip. His eyes could not hide the momentary surprise. The coffee tasted strong. Slightly bitter like Margaret's way of making it, but with a gentle sweetness in the aftertaste, like Emily's own mark. Robert nodded slightly, not saying a word, but in that moment, a warm undercurrent flowed between father and daughter. In the evening, Emily rummaged through a pile of old CDs and picked out a jazz album her mother had loved. The soft melodies filled the house, no longer leaving the silence that had blanketed it like the days before. Robert sat in the old armchair, eyes half closed, letting the music guide him back to the peaceful days gone by. Emily, sitting a few feet away, also quietly enjoyed that silent connection. Day by day, small habits began to form. Emily prepared chamomile tea in the evening, just as her mother had done. She placed a small note on the dining table with a simple message, "Good night, Dad," or, "It's a nice day. Don't forget to sit on the porch for a while." At first, Robert just accepted it silently. But gradually, Emily noticed a small change in his response, a slower nod, a smile that flickered at the corner of his lips, or sometimes, a small question, "How was work today?" One weekend afternoon, Emily suggested that they cook dinner together. Her father hesitated for a moment, then agreed. In the sunlit kitchen, the two of them fussed over vegetables, marinated meat, bickered over seasonings, and laughed at the strangeness of the finished dish. Those laughs, simple, unexpected, were like the first cracks in the wall of silence that had surrounded them for so long. There was no magic that would make all the pain disappear. But with small, repeated gestures, Emily and Robert were quietly lighting up the first rays of light in a house that had been shrouded in darkness. And in doing so, they are beginning to learn how to live again, not to forget Margaret, but to let her love continue to live in every moment of everyday life. One cool morning, Robert Turner hesitantly suggested, "We should clean the attic. It's about time." Emily looked at her father, seeing hesitation and determination in his eyes. She nodded, knowing that this was more than just a matter of cleaning out things. It was a journey into the deepest memories they had been avoiding. The small attic of the old house smelled of rotten wood, dust, and time. As Robert pulled back the shutters and climbed the rickety stairs, Emily followed close behind, her heart pounding with an indescribable excitement. The dim light from a single ceiling light dimly illuminated the piles of cardboard boxes, old suitcases, and items forgotten years ago. They started with the boxes closest to the door. Inside were simple but nostalgic items. A photo album with a peeling leather cover. Christmas cards Emily had made herself in elementary school. A few doodles her mother had proudly hung on the kitchen wall. Robert flipped through the album, his eyes softening when he saw a photo of Margaret smiling brightly in the ocean sunlight, her hair blowing wildly in the wind. Emily sat silently beside him, feeling the memories rushing back like a rushing stream, both gentle and painful. They continued to dig into the old boxes, finding small items. A floral dress their mother had worn every spring. A notebook filled with recipes. Handwritten letters her mother had sent Robert during their early years together. Each item, each piece of paper, each photo was like a piece of Margaret's soul, quietly kept here. Robert occasionally paused for a long time before an object, his rough hands caressing it gently as if afraid to shatter the fragile memory. In an old chest pushed into the corner of the attic, Emily happened to find a thick book. When she lifted it, a small envelope fell out from between the pages. On the envelope, the familiar handwriting made Emily choke. For Robert, if one day I am no longer here. She handed the envelope to her father without saying a word. Robert took it with both hands, his trembling eyes scanning the soft writing. He did not open the letter immediately. Instead, Robert sat down in the old chair, hugged the letter to his chest, and closed his eyes for a moment that seemed endless. Emily sat down beside him, waiting silently, respecting his sacred space. The attic, once a place of storage, is now a sacred place, a place where father and son dare to face their pain head-on. Rather than running away, no words are needed, just being together, listening to the echoes of the past. To understand, loss does not end love. It only changes how love is preserved and continues to live. And here, amid the dusty cardboard boxes and dim light, Emily and Robert take another small, but important, step on their journey to healing. Robert Turner sat for a long time in the old chair in the corner of the attic, his hands clasping the small envelope with Margaret's handwriting. Emily sat beside him, waiting silently, respecting the privacy in which her father was immersed. The faint yellow light from the ceiling lamp shone down, illuminating the deep wrinkles on Robert's face, the traces of time, of pain, and of love that never faded. Finally, with a slow, trembling movement, Robert opened the envelope and took out a thin sheet of paper that had turned the color of time. His voice was hoarse as he began to read, slowly, as if afraid that if he hurried, Margaret's words would disappear. Dear Robert, if you are reading this, it means I am no longer with you as we once wished. But please do not be sad for too long, for I am still here, in every memory, every look, every gentle gesture we shared. When the sadness becomes too great, look for me in Emily. I see myself in her steadfast gaze, in her tenderness for the world, and in the faith we nurtured together. Let her remind you that love never dies. It only changes shape, softer, deeper, and more eternal. I love you, and I will always be here. Margaret. When he finished reading, Robert was silent. He lowered the paper to his lap, his eyes closed as if trying to hold on to every word, every breath of his beloved wife. Emily sat silently beside him, her hand gently touching her father's. The gesture needed no explanation, it was simply a silent sharing. An invisible thread connecting two souls struggling with the pain of loss. A moment later, Robert opened his eyes, his gaze watery but no longer panicked. He turned to Emily, and for the first time since the funeral. There was no wall of silence between them, no more curt answers, there was only complete presence, complete understanding. I'm sorry I left you to suffer alone, Robert said softly, his voice a thin wisp of smoke drifting through the air. Emily shook her head, tears glistening in her eyes. I've never been alone, she whispered. I've always been here, just like you. They sat together in the attic for a long time, letting the memories flood in, letting the sadness flow like water, not trying to fight it. It was not a denial of the pain. It was a gentle acceptance that loss was part of love. And only by facing it could they truly keep it whole. When they got back downstairs, Robert carefully folded the letter and put it in the breast pocket closest to his heart. Emily looked at him, seeing a subtle but obvious change in her father's demeanor, no longer a helpless collapse, but a man learning to stand up, carrying love, memories, and gratitude. The old house seemed to change too, as if breathing a sigh of relief after months of being held in sadness. And in that twilight afternoon, the Turners found more than just a part of Margaret. They found themselves again, through the fragments of memory, through the love that remained intact despite time. In the days after that afternoon in the attic, the Turners' house seemed to change little by little. The heavy silence that weighed down every corner of the walls was gone. Instead, there were small but lively sounds, the light clanking of dishes in the kitchen, the shifting of chairs, the soft jazz music playing from the old radio. Emily Turner felt the change in every breath. It was not a loud, hurried noise, but a slow, gentle rhythm, like small seedlings patiently breaking through the soil after a long winter. One morning, as Emily made coffee, she saw Robert Turner leaning against the kitchen door, silently observing. It was no longer the quiet aloofness that had once been. There was something warmer, more intimate in his eyes, as if he had truly returned from somewhere far away. "When you have time," Robert said, his voice still a little awkward, "I think we should fix the front porch. The roof's been broken for a long time." Emily turned, smiling softly. It was a simple, ordinary suggestion, but to her it felt like a bridge across a gap she'd once thought impossible to bridge. That evening, they cleaned out the garage, which was filled with gardening tools and old furniture. Emily swept cobwebs from the wooden shelves, while Robert meticulously inspected the rusty hammers and screws. There were moments when they laughed at the odd things Margaret had kept: a cracked vase, a tattered wide-brimmed hat she'd worn on picnics. Their laughter, echoing in the vast space, cleared away some of the dark corners that had weighed on her soul. One night, Emily left a small note on the dining table before going to bed. On it, she wrote, "Thank you, Dad, for not giving up. Let's continue tomorrow." The next morning, when she walked into the kitchen, she found the note carefully folded by her father, placed under a cup of freshly brewed coffee, with a slice of toast beside it. No words were needed. The gesture was enough for Emily to know that her father had accepted, understood, and was trying, in small steps, with her. They weren't completely healed. The wound was still there, smoldering, but in this way, with small actions, the Turners were finding a way to live together, not just survive, but truly live, in a world that was without Margaret, but never without love. That afternoon, after repairing part of the front porch, Robert Turner sat down in an old rocking chair, his eyes gazing out into the sunlit yard. Emily gathered up her gardening tools and glanced at her father. Something about his thoughtful posture made her sense a change. A decision was forming. After a while, Robert looked up, his voice soft but firm. "Are you free for the next few days?" Emily was surprised by the unexpected question. She nodded, her curiosity rising. Robert let out a long breath, as if a burden had been lifted. "I think it's time we took that trip your mother has always wanted." He paused, then added, "to the Great Smoky Mountains." In that moment, all sound seemed to stop. Emily remembered the old map her mother had marked, the stories of the mist-shrouded mountains and the trails of autumn leaves that Margaret had always wanted to visit. But a busy life, responsibilities, and then a sudden illness had left that dream unfulfilled. Emily put the bucket down and walked closer to her father. "I'll go with you," she said, without hesitation. Robert looked at her, a thin smile on his lips, a smile not just of relief, but of hope. No one said the word Margaret in that moment, but they both knew this trip was not just to fulfill an old wish, but to open a new chapter for themselves. A chapter written with memories, with love, and with the courage to step out of the darkness. That same evening, Robert Turner rummaged through an old drawer in the living room and pulled out a crumpled map. Emily sat across from him, a small notebook and pen in hand, ready to take notes. A quiet excitement was evident in both of their movements, as if this trip were not simply a journey but a ritual of beginning anew. They spread the map out on the table, slowly tracing the route. Robert pointed to the places her mother had marked in red pen. The route through Cherokee. The trails that led into the red maple forest in the fall. The tiny rest stops Margaret had read about in guidebooks. "My mother wants to see the fall foliage at Clingman's Dome," Robert said, his voice a whisper to the past. Emily nodded, taking note of every landmark, every rest stop, every possible roadside eatery. The next day, they packed together. Emily picked out some snacks for the trip: cheese sandwiches, red apple crisps, and some homemade granola bars. Robert inspected the car, changing the oil, checking the tires, and filling it with gas, all as meticulously as if this were the most important trip of their lives. On the passenger seat, they placed a bag of old music CDs, all jazz and country songs that Margaret had loved. One of them, Louis Armstrong's "What a Wonderful World," Emily carefully placed at the top of the playlist. While packing, Emily found her mother's dark blue wool scarf, the one that had touched her father's heart in the attic. Without a word, she folded the scarf and placed it gently in the suitcase, a silent pledge that Margaret would join them on this journey. Robert saw the action. He said nothing, just put his hand on Emily's shoulder, squeezing it gently, a simple gesture, but one filled with gratitude and love. The night before their departure, they sat on the porch, looking up at the dark, starry sky. "I think your mother would be proud of us," Robert said, his voice hoarse, but his eyes sparkling. Emily leaned her head against his shoulder, a rare sense of peace welling up inside her. This trip, however belated, was not just about fulfilling a missed wish. It was also about learning to remember, to love, and to move forward together. The next morning, the old silver car rolled out of Savannah before the sun was high in the sky. Fog hung over the cobblestone streets, casting a dreamy beauty over the ancient city. Emily Turner sat in the passenger seat, clutching a small backpack containing snacks, a few books, and her mother's blue wool scarf. Robert Turner drove intently, his eyes occasionally glancing at the carefully marked map. In the car, soft jazz music played from the old record player, filling the empty space with warm, familiar melodies. During the first leg of the journey, they chatted about everything from old lessons Robert had taught his students to strange foods Emily had tried on business trips. Not big stories, just small, ordinary stories, but they weaved an invisible thread connecting two souls that had once been far apart. As they crossed the Georgia border and entered Tennessee, the landscape changed dramatically. Mountains rose in the distance, and red maple forests stretched to the horizon. The golden sunlight poured through the trees, painting the landscape in vivid shades of red, orange, and yellow. Emily rolled down the window, letting in a cool breeze, carrying the scent of grass and damp earth. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her eyes lighting up like a child seeing something magical for the first time. Robert glanced at his daughter, the corners of his mouth curving into a smile. There was no more sadness in his eyes, only pride and peace. They stopped at a small town along the road, where there was a family-run restaurant painted a simple white. Sitting in the cafe, sipping pancakes topped with sweet syrup, Robert recounted his and Margaret's old travels, the times they'd driven in their old car, the nights camping under the stars, the mornings waking up to dew covering the tent. Emily listened intently, smiling at the stories she'd never heard. Each memory, however wistful, brought Margaret back to life, not as a loss, but as a vivid part of their journey. The final stretch of road took them up winding slopes, where the air was cooler and the maple forests more vibrant than ever. When the car stopped at a high vantage point, Emily and Robert stepped out. Before them, a valley of red, orange, and yellow stretched endlessly under the gentle glow of the sunset. Thin clouds drifted lazily by, like light curtains falling over the magnificent landscape. Robert stood still for a long time, his eyes sparkling in the afternoon sunlight. "Your mother was right," he whispered. "This place is breathtakingly beautiful." Emily clutched the scarf in her hands, tears welling in her eyes. "And she would be so happy to know we'd been here," she replied, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. In that moment, amid the vast expanse of sea and sky, amid the scent of grass and trees and the whisper of the wind through the leaves, the Turners felt Margaret's presence, not as a sad ghost, but as an inseparable part of the love that continued to spread with every breath. This trip was not just the fulfillment of an unfinished dream. It was also a silent affirmation: love, whatever form it took, would always lead them back to each other. As the last of the sunset gave way to night, Robert and Emily Turner stood silently on the top of the pass, where the wind blew through the old trees. No one spoke. No words were needed to describe what they both felt. Before them, the Great Smoky Mountains stretched out, their layers overlapping each other like endless waves in a sea of pale purple mist. Under the rising crescent moon, the scene was surreally beautiful, quiet but majestic, making all the pain and regret in one's heart seem to be soothed. Robert gently squeezed the woolen scarf Emily had wrapped around his neck before getting out of the car, the scarf that had belonged to Margaret. His hands trembled, not from the cold, but from emotion. After a long moment, Robert bowed his head and whispered, "I feel like your mother is still here, somewhere around me." Emily squeezed her father's hand, her eyes stinging. "I can feel it too," she replied, her voice trembling. They stood side by side, shoulder to shoulder, letting the cold autumn wind soak into their coats, letting the tears flow gently into the darkness. No more heavy sadness, no more fear of facing memories. Only love, steadfast, gentle, and eternal. In that moment, on the windy mountaintop, Emily and Robert Turner found a new peace. Not by forgetting the person they had lost, but by letting that love live on, through every beat, every step, every breath, in the lives they bravely continued to walk. Robert Turner's silver car left the Great Smoky Mountains early one morning, when thin wisps of fog still lingered between the mountainsides. All the way back, Emily sat quietly beside her father, looking out the fogged-up window. A feeling of relief, yet full of emotional resonance, welled up inside her like a silent stream. They didn't talk much, but the silence was no longer as heavy as before, but warm like a thin blanket covering two newly warmed souls. As the city of Savannah came into view, Emily felt a clear change in herself. The cobblestone streets, the rows of ancient oaks, the familiar house with a faded tile roof, everything was the same. But somehow, everything seemed to have taken on a new look, no longer sad, but filled with the tenderness of reconciled memories. Robert stopped the car in front of the house. They didn't rush in, they sat in the car for a while, as if to say goodbye to the journey, to hold on to the feelings they hadn't yet named. Finally, Robert opened the car door and stepped out first. Emily followed, clutching the strap of her backpack, where her mother's wool scarf still lay, a gentle reminder that Margaret was always with them. As she entered the house, Emily took a deep breath. The smell of old wood, fabric, and a hint of lavender wafted through the air. Everything was painfully familiar, yet strangely warm. Robert hung his coat on the rack and turned to look at Emily. For the first time, there was no shadow of loss in his eyes, only a new, fragile, but real peace. That evening, they sat at the old dining table, sipping chamomile tea and sharing small stories. Which road was the most beautiful? Which song reminded them of their mother the most? Which memories should be kept the longest? There was no more reluctance, no more awkward silences. The house, once a witness to deep sadness, now became a place to nurture new beginnings, starting with the love that Margaret had left behind. Robert and Emily understood that the longing would not go away, but they also understood that they had found a way to live with it, as an indispensable part of their lives. And in that quiet, loving atmosphere, they truly returned, not only home, but also to each other. Since returning home, a new rhythm of life has gradually formed between Robert Turner and Emily in the old house in Savannah. No more days spent in heavy silence. No more evenings spent alone in a corner. Between them, the fragile bond that had begun at first has now become stronger little by little, like meticulous stitches mending a torn cloth after a storm. Every morning, Emily makes coffee and prepares a slice of toast for her father. Every evening, Robert turns on the old radio, chooses some soft music, and sits with Emily on the porch, sipping warm tea under the starry sky. Small conversations have also begun to flourish, sometimes just trivial questions. What book did you read today? Does Dad remember what Mom's favorite food is? Or trivial jokes from the old days. Every word, every smile, every nod of understanding, all were like thin threads woven together, silently mending two broken souls. One afternoon, Robert handed Emily a small, old wooden frame. "I think," he said, his voice slow, "we should hang some new pictures." Emily took the frame, her heart filled with an emotion that was hard to name. Not to replace old memories, but to continue writing their family story, a story that Margaret was still following, even though she was no longer present in her familiar form. On weekends, they fixed up the house together, resweeping the porch, painting the fence, tending the flowers her mother had loved, amid the hammering and the giggles and the paint smearing on their sleeves. They find the simple joy of building a home, not to fill a void, but to turn pain into a foundation for a stronger future. Robert and Emily's relationship is not a return to the past, nor is it a forgetting. It is a new version, deeper, more enduring, woven from loss, love, and the courage to keep going. In the midst of a house stained with memories, the Turners find each other again, not as broken people, but as companions, carrying the light of the past to guide the days ahead. One early spring morning, as the pale sunlight spilled over the small garden behind the house, Emily Turner sat on the porch, a cup of hot tea in her hand. She flipped through her mother's old notebook, writing down new plans for the house, planting a few more lavender bushes, fixing the old swing, expanding the kitchen corner to make it brighter. Inside, Robert Turner was busy repairing the old radio, the thing that had played with them so many memories over the past months. No one needed to say it, but both understood. An old chapter had closed. It was no longer days of drowning in loss, nor forced oblivion, but a gentle acceptance that love was still there, and could still continue, in a different way. That afternoon, Robert gave Emily a small wooden box. Inside were new photos from their trip to the Great Smoky Mountains. Red leaves, a trail shrouded in mist, and a picture of them standing side by side, looking out toward the horizon. "We should start a new album," Robert said, his voice low but warm. Emily looked at the photos, feeling a strange emotion, not to replace old memories, but to prove that life, despite loss, continued, beautiful in its own way. That evening, they sat on the porch, watching the sky turn from orange to purple. The wind blew gently through the trees, carrying the scent of fresh grass and lavender. Emily leaned her head against her father's shoulder, feeling his steady breathing. In that moment, she knew their journey of healing was not over, but they found their own rhythm, one no longer driven by pain, but guided by love and hope. Closing a chapter doesn't mean forgetting the past. It means learning to carry the past, with all its beauty and pain, forward with greater strength. And with each new step, the Turners know that Margaret is always with them, in every smile, every dream, every sunrise they greet together. A chapter closes, a new one begins. Thank you for listening to the end of the story. Emily and Robert Turner made it through the darkest days of their lives, not by forgetting the people they loved, but by learning to hold on to their memories, accept the pain, and turn it into the foundation for a new life. They learned that love doesn't end when someone is gone. That love remains, in the small gestures, in the habits that continue, in the unfinished journeys that are completed, and in the silent beats of hearts that still have the courage to love. Loss doesn't erase what once was. It just opens a new path, where memories, gratitude, and love intertwine, creating a gentle symphony, guiding those brave enough to move forward. With each small action, with each shaky step, Emily and Robert found each other again, and found themselves again. See you in the next story. Team Daily Unexpected Stories.